Nobody notices the shadows until it's too late. That's the thing about a city at night. It's already full of darkness. Darkness between buildings, darkness in doorways, darkness pooling under streetlights where the geometry of illumination runs out. People move through it without thinking because darkness is familiar, because it has always been there, because the human brain is extraordinarily good at filtering out the things it has decided are normal. A shadow is just a shadow. A crowd is just a crowd. The city hums and pulses and breathes around you, and you move through it like water through pipes, automatic and unthinking, because that's what cities train you to do. So nobody noticed the shadows first. They noticed the lights. It started at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, which mattered because Thursdays were busy. The particular urban busy of a night that wanted to be a weekend but hadn't quite committed yet. Downtown was alive with the specific energy of people who decided the week was close enough to over. Restaurants spilling conversation onto sidewalks. Music bleeding from club entrances. Neon advertisements cycling through their colors above streets slick from an earlier rain. Then the grid failed. Not gradually. Not the slow brownout of an overloaded system shedding load in careful increments. All at once. A single, massive drop. Like someone had reached into the city's chest and closed a fist around its heart. Block after block going dark in a cascade that moved too fast for any normal electrical failure. Too coordinated for coincidence. Emergency lighting kicked in on critical infrastructure, and car headlights suddenly became the primary illumination on streets that had been bright 60 seconds ago. People stopped walking and looked up, because that's what people do when the familiar suddenly fails. They look up, as if the sky might have an explanation. It didn't, but the cameras did. The Humanadyne monitoring facility on the 14th floor of an unremarkable office building 3 blocks from the blackout's epicenter was staffed by 4 analysts on the night shift, none of whom had expected their Thursday to become something they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. The facility's independent power supply kept their systems running through the grid failure, which meant their cameras kept recording, which meant senior analyst Reyes was watching downtown go dark on 6 simultaneous feeds when she caught the movement in feed 3. A group of people, 6 of them, moving through the newly darkened street with the calm, unhurried pace of individuals who found the blackout neither surprising nor inconvenient. That alone was enough to make Reyes lean closer to her screen. Everyone else in frame had stopped, or was reaching for phones, or was doing the instinctive human thing of clustering with strangers in the sudden dark. These 6 kept moving. Same pace, same spacing between them. Too synchronized for a group of friends. Too fluid for a military formation. Then one of them passed under the beam of a vehicle's headlights, and Reyes saw the shadow. It stretched wrong. Not the way shadows stretch when a light source is at a low angle. She knew that geometry, had cataloged it in years of monitoring work. This was different. The shadow that extended behind the figure was shaped like something that didn't match the body casting it. Too many angles. Limbs that suggested a different underlying architecture. An insect-like articulation in the way it moved across the wet pavement, as if the shadow was showing the truth that the body was hiding. She switched to thermal imaging. The 6 figures showed no heat signature. Her hand was already moving to the alert panel when the system beat her to it. Every screen in the facility flashed simultaneously, the automated biodetection protocol triggering on the same data her eyes had been processing. The thermal absence, the behavioral anomaly, and something else. Something the sensors were measuring in a frequency range that didn't have a standard name because the technology to detect it had only existed for 14 months. The alert text appeared in urgent red across every monitor in the facility. Non-human biosignatures confirmed. Multiple host bodies compromised. Reyes stared at it. Around her, the other 3 analysts had gone completely still, the way people go still when a situation exceeds their training and their brain needs a moment to catch up. She found her voice first. It came out quieter than she intended. "They're not just here," she said. "They've been here for years." Johnny B had not been thinking about alien infiltration when the night started. He'd been thinking about the baseline from the third set at Club Meridian and whether the chicken skewers from the food truck outside were as good as they'd been last week. These were the correct things to be thinking about on a Thursday night, and he was committed to them with the particular focus of someone who had spent too much of his recent life thinking about things that were considerably less enjoyable. Gloria walked beside him through the neon-soaked street, 3 steps ahead the way she always was, her presence cutting through the crowd with an ease that Johnny had spent years trying to replicate and never quite managed. She had a way of moving through spaces that suggested the space had been designed with her in mind, confident without being aggressive, aware without being watchful. It was one of approximately 40 things about her that Johnny found quietly remarkable and had never said out loud. "You're doing it again," Gloria said without turning around. "Doing what?" "The thing where you're about to say something and then decide not to." "I was thinking about the chicken skewers." She turned then, just enough to give him the look. "Johnny, they were really good last week." The neon above them cycled through blue and pink and yellow, painting the crowd in shifting colors. Music from a nearby club pushed through its doors every time someone entered or left. A brief wash of bass and rhythm before the sound dampened again. The street smelled like rain and food, and the particular urban chemistry of too many people in a small space choosing to enjoy themselves. Johnny felt the spark before he understood why. It started at the base of his spine. Not pain exactly, more like the physical memory of pain, the way a scar sometimes aches before weather changes. A prickling that moved up through his nervous system and collected in his hands with a familiar, uncomfortable charge of energy that had no appropriate outlet. He curled his fingers instinctively, containing it, which worked until it didn't. A nearby streetlight flickered. Just once, just briefly. But Gloria saw it and saw his hands at the same moment, and her expression shifted from amusement to attention. "Johnny, I know." He exhaled slowly, the way Elle had taught him. Controlled breath, deliberate release, treating the electrical buildup like pressure in a system that needed careful management rather than sudden venting. The charge subsided. The streetlight steadied. "I'm fine." "What triggered it?" He looked around, trying to identify the source of the unease that had preceded the surge. The crowd moved normally around them. Music played. Somewhere nearby, a group of people laughed at something. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except 2 men standing at the edge of the sidewalk 15 feet away, watching them. Not the casual watching of strangers sharing a public space. The fixed, unblinking attention of people whose eyes had decided on a target and hadn't moved since. They wore dark suits that were wrong for the temperature and the venue, their posture identical in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like calibration. No drinks, no phones, no conversation between them, just the watching. "Gloria," Johnny said quietly, "I see them." The 2 men approached with the smooth, unhurried movement of people who had already calculated every variable of the interaction and found the outcome satisfactory. Up close, the wrongness was more specific and harder to name. Their faces were symmetrical in a way human faces weren't. Their blinking slightly mistimed relative to their apparent emotional state. Their smiles present, but not quite connected to the muscles that should have been producing them. "Johnny B," the one on the left said. "Not a question, a confirmation of data." "That's not a name I gave you," Johnny replied. "We are authorized recruitment officers for an advanced research initiative." The one on the right spoke in perfect synchronization with the left, the sentences divided between them with the seamless efficiency of a single script delivered by 2 speakers. "Your bioenergy profile has been flagged for integration into Humanadyne asset development." Gloria stepped slightly forward. "Who sent you?" "Planetary stabilization requires," the left one began. "Optimized human capital deployment across," the right one continued. "All identified energy-significant individuals within." "Stop," Johnny said. They stopped, simultaneously, completely. The crowd moved around them, oblivious. the way crowds always were when something was wrong in their peripheral vision. "Your speech pattern," Gloria said carefully. "It's glitching." Something crossed their faces that wasn't an expression so much as the placeholder where an expression should have been. And then the one on the left said, and in a tone stripped of its recruitment officer warmth and replaced with something flat and absolute. "The demonite integration phase has already begun." Johnny felt the charge build before the sentence finished. Not the slow prickling from before, a surge, immediate and total. The electrical energy in his system responding to something his conscious mind was still processing while his body had already reached a conclusion. His hands came up without a decision being made about raising them. The discharge was not controlled. A 3-foot radius of electronics died instantly. Phones in nearby pockets went dark. A passing electric scooter stopped mid-roll. 2 streetlights blew their housings with sharp pops of light and smoke. The 2 men in suits were thrown backward by the pulse. Not injured, not stumbling, but physically displaced. Or their bodies absorbing the electrical impact with a response that was wrong in a way that Johnny's mind filed away in the half-second before everything else happened. Because as they were thrown back, as the force of the discharge hit them, the skin along their faces and hands didn't bruise or redden. It fractured. Like a screen dropped on concrete, a spiderweb of geometric fragments, sharp-edged and angular, briefly revealing something underneath that was neither flesh nor machine, but suggested elements of both. Dark, articulated, present for less than 2 seconds before whatever maintained their surface appearance reasserted itself, and they looked human again. They looked at Johnny with the placeholder expressions. Then they turned and walked into the crowd, and which swallowed them with the crowd's usual indifference to things happening at its edges. Gloria grabbed Johnny's arm. "What was that?" "I don't know." He stared at the space where they'd been. The charge in his hands was gone, fully expended, leaving behind the hollow exhaustion that always followed an uncontrolled surge. "But they knew my name before I gave it. They knew about Humanadyne." "They knew about Humanadyne," he confirmed. Above them, 3 blocks away, a city block that had been normally lit 60 seconds ago went completely dark as the blackout's edge reached their street. In the sudden reduction of ambient light, Johnny noticed something he wouldn't have seen otherwise: the shadows of the people around them, cast by car headlights and emergency lighting, moving naturally, correctly, in perfect correspondence with the bodies producing them. He thought about the 2 men in suits. He tried to remember what their shadows had looked like. He couldn't. And the fact that he couldn't, that his memory had no record of something that should have been unremarkable enough to ignore, told him something that the fractured skin and the synchronized speech and the flat warning about integration phases hadn't quite managed to make concrete. Whatever those men were, they hadn't cast shadows at all. If you want to see more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or universe you'd want to see explored in the comments below. This is only the beginning. Billy didn't believe them. This was not surprising. Billy had a particular relationship with extraordinary claims that could be summarized as productive skepticism on his best days and exhausting obstinacy on his worst. And the look on his face when Johnny finished describing the men in suits suggested this was trending toward the latter. He sat across the Humanadyne briefing table with his arms crossed and the specific expression of someone running every alternative explanation through a mental filter and finding each one more palatable than the one being offered. "Men in black," he said, "with glitching skin." "Geometric fragmentation," Gloria corrected. "It wasn't glitching, it was structural, like the surface cracking to show something underneath." In the middle of a nightclub district, on a Thursday. The blackout was real. Billy," Johnny said. 3 blocks went dark. You can pull the grid data right now and grid failures happen, especially in that district. The infrastructure is 20 years old and they've been patching it since. "They knew my name," Johnny said. "Before I gave it. They said Humanadyne. They said integration phase." He put his hands flat on the table. "They said demonite." The word landed differently than the others. Johnny watched it hit Billy's skepticism and do something to it. Not dissolve it, but introduce a hairline fracture. Because demonite wasn't a word that existed in public record. It wasn't in any database accessible outside of Humanadyne's classified research archive. Wasn't in any report that had circulated beyond the senior analyst level. Wasn't something two men in suits at a nightclub district should have been able to produce in casual conversation. Billy uncrossed his arms. Say that again. Demonite integration phase, Johnny repeated. Exact words. The silence that followed had a different quality than the skeptical silence from before. This one was thoughtful, which was more useful. L, Billy said. Run a bioenergy analysis on Johnny's discharge residue. Full spectrum. L was already moving before the sentence finished, because L was always already moving. Her hands at a keyboard the way other people's hands existed at rest. The interface between her mind and the systems she inhabited so practiced it had become a kind of fluency. She pulled up the energy signature from Johnny's surge, cross-referenced it against the baseline readings they'd established during his early Humanadyne assessments, and ran the comparative analysis through 3 different diagnostic frameworks simultaneously. The results came back in 40 seconds. Elle stared at them. Then she ran them again. That's not right, she said. What's not right? Gloria asked. Johnny's discharge residue. Elle turned the display so the room could see it. 2 energy signature profiles side by side, one labeled Rogers, J baseline, and the other labeled field discharge, 2347. This is his established bioenergy signature. This is what his power produced tonight. She paused. They don't match. Billy leaned forward. What do you mean they don't match? It's the same person. I know it's the same person. But the field discharge signature contains a frequency component that isn't present in his baseline profile. Something external interacted with his power output in the field. Something that left a trace. She zoomed in on the anomalous frequency band. This isn't human bioenergy. I've run it against every cataloged energy signature in our database. It matches nothing. Johnny looked at his hands. The men in suits. When your surge hit them, whatever they're made of left an imprint on your discharge. Like a fingerprint on glass. Elle's expression was that of someone who wanted very badly for their own analysis to be wrong. Johnny, whatever those things were, they weren't producing human bioenergy. They were producing something we've never measured before. Billy stood up slowly. The obstinacy was gone. In its place was the look he got when a situation had exceeded his preferred reality, and he was making the transition to operational mode. Not graceful, not immediate, but genuine. Okay, we take this seriously. He turned to the main display. L, pull up the Humanadyne personnel files. Cross-reference anyone with access to the demonite classification level and flag anyone who's had an unscheduled absence in the past. The display flickered. Not the clean flicker of a system processing a heavy request. A deeper instability, as if something behind the interface had momentarily lost confidence in what it was supposed to be showing. The personnel files loaded, rows of names and photographs and access credentials. And then, for approximately 3 seconds, the names changed. Not all of them, not randomly. Specific entries, and scattered through the database, their names replaced by strings of characters that weren't any alphabet Johnny recognized before the display stabilized and the names returned to their normal state. Everyone in the room had seen it. Tell me that was a rendering error, Billy said. Elle's hands were already moving across her keyboard with the focused urgency of someone who understood that what they'd just witnessed was not a rendering error and needed to understand it immediately. Someone accessed our system. She pulled up the intrusion log. No, not accessed. It's rewriting, selectively. Specific personnel records, specific access logs. She stopped typing. Billy. What? The records that changed, the names that flickered. She pulled the affected entries into a separate display. These are all people who've had unsupervised facility access in the past 6 months, night shifts, maintenance windows, low surveillance periods. She looked up. Someone isn't just in our system. Someone has been mapping our blind spots. The room processed that in silence. Gloria said what everyone was thinking. Either someone hacked our entire network, or our network, Elle finished quietly, was never entirely human to begin with. The energy residue trail led them to the Callaway industrial zone 40 minutes later, a decommissioned manufacturing district 3 miles east of downtown where the city's ambitions had outpaced its budget and left behind a collection of empty buildings that were too structurally sound to demolish and too expensive to repurpose. At night, without functioning streetlights, the zone existed in a darkness that felt deliberate, the kind of dark that accumulated in spaces where human activity had withdrawn and left something else to fill the absence. Elle had tracked the anomalous frequency signature from Johnny's discharge residue to a specific building in the zone's northeastern quadrant, a former processing facility whose footprint suggested it had once housed industrial equipment on a significant scale. The signature was faint, degraded by distance and time, but present enough to follow. "There's active energy inside," Elle reported, her scanner reading the building as they approached through a gap in the perimeter fencing. Not electrical, not thermal. The same frequency band as the anomalous component from Johnny's discharge. "They came here," Johnny said. "Or something like them is already here," Gloria replied. Billy held up a fist, the stop signal, and they froze in the shadow of the fence line. He'd heard something. They all heard it a second later. Movement inside the building, the kind that suggested multiple people operating in coordinated patterns. Too organized for squatters, too quiet for legitimate industrial activity. "We're not alone," Billy said. They entered through a side access point that Elle identified as unsecured, moving in the practiced formation of a team that had done enough field operations to have a formation worth practicing. The interior of the building was vast and dark, the original industrial equipment long removed, leaving behind an open floor plan that amplified sound and complicated visibility. Emergency lighting from a portable source somewhere in the upper level cast thin illumination down through gaps in the mezzanine floor above. They were halfway across the ground floor when the other team appeared. 6 figures dropped from the mezzanine simultaneously, a deployment that was too coordinated for coincidence and too fast for improvisation, which meant they'd been watching the approach and had chosen this specific moment to reveal themselves. They were equipped in a way that Humanadyne's field teams weren't. Tactical gear that incorporated technology Johnny didn't recognize. Energy-based equipment that hummed at a frequency he felt in his back teeth, and the particular body language of people who were very good at this and knew it. The standoff established itself in the space of 2 seconds. "Humanadyne," the lead figure said. Not a greeting, an identification, delivered the way you'd identify a threat classification. "You have us at a disadvantage," Billy said carefully. "You know who we are. We know what you are. The question is whether you know what you are." The lead figure, a woman, her face partially obscured by tactical gear, her posture suggesting command without the need to announce it, held a scanning device leveled at Johnny's chest. "Because your energy signature is reading as non-standard, significantly non-standard." "He's human," Gloria said, an edge entering her voice. "That's what a demonite infiltration unit would present as," a second figure said from the flank. Billy raised a hand toward his team, easy, measured, while keeping his eyes on the opposing group. "We're not demonites. We're investigating an incident involving possible non-human contact in the downtown district tonight. Energy residue led us here." "Same residue led us here," the lead figure said, "which means either you're following the same trail we are, or you're the trail. We encountered 2 individuals tonight whose biosignatures didn't match human parameters," Elle said, stepping forward slightly, scanner visible in her hand, the gesture calculated to communicate data sharing rather than aggression. They knew classified Humanadyne terminology. They referenced demonite integration. "We're trying to understand what that means." A pause from the opposing team. The lead figure and the one on her left exchanged a look that communicated something compressed and significant. "You don't know about the integration phase," the lead figure said. It wasn't skeptical. It was something closer to concerned. "We know the words," Johnny said. We don't know the context. Then you've been operating blind inside a compromised facility. She lowered the scanner slightly. Not a gesture of trust exactly, but a reduction of immediate hostility. We're Wildcats, independent monitoring operation. We've been tracking demonite activity in this city for... The scanner in her hand spiked. Its alarm triggered simultaneously with Elle's equipment and with something in Johnny's chest that wasn't a device, but functioned like one. The pricking, building charge of his power responding to a stimulus his senses hadn't consciously registered yet. Something's in the building with us, Elle said. It came from the upper level, a shift in the darkness above the mezzanine, on a movement that was too fluid and too silent for a human body navigating industrial infrastructure in the dark. Then another, then a third. The same geometric fragmentation Johnny had witnessed in the suits downtown, briefly visible when the portable emergency light caught the edges of whatever was up there before it pulled back into shadow. The Wildcats moved instantly, their formation shifting from confrontation to perimeter defense with the snap of a team that had drilled this specific scenario. It pulled the Humanadyne team into an involuntary parallel response, both groups suddenly facing outward, the standoff between them replaced by the shared problem above. "How many?" Billy called to the Wildcat lead. "Scanner's reading 4, she replied. "But demonites distort scanner readings. Could be more." "Johnny," Gloria said quietly. "Your hands." He looked down. The charge was already visible. Not the faint sparking of emotional leakage, but the concentrated luminescence of power building toward a threshold. He could feel the difference between this and every previous surge. This was bigger. This was his system responding to the presence above them the way a body responds to a pathogen. Total mobilization, every resource converging on a single response. "I can't hold this one," he said. "Don't," the Wildcat lead said sharply. "Not in an enclosed..." He released it. The discharge expanded outward in a perfect sphere. Not the ragged directional burst of his previous uncontrolled surges, but something that filled the building's interior like a pressure wave, touching every surface simultaneously. Every electronic device in range went dark. The portable emergency light died. The Wildcat's equipment powered down. Elle's scanner went offline. The humming of the energy-based gear reduced to silence and complete darkness. And then, from above, the sound of 4 or more things that had been using the darkness as cover suddenly finding themselves exposed in it, their movement patterns changing from patient observation to the particular rhythm of something that has lost its advantage and knows it. Then the emergency light flickered back on. Johnny's discharge had lasted less than 3 seconds and the Wildcat's gear was already rebooting, Elle's scanner reinitializing, the building returning to its prior state of thin illumination and thick shadow. The things above the mezzanine were gone. No sound, no movement, as if they'd never been there. While the Wildcat operative closest to Johnny, a younger man whose tactical gear bore a different insignia than the others, suggesting a different operational background, had his scanner raised and pointed directly at Johnny's chest. His face had done something complicated during the discharge. Now it was doing something more complicated still. He lowered the scanner slowly. "Commander," he said to the Wildcat lead. His voice had lost its operational calm. His energy signature. "I'm reading it," she said. "It's identical." He looked at Johnny with an expression that had moved past suspicion into something more unsettling. "Commander, it's identical to the infiltration unit we lost contact with 14 months ago." The building was very quiet. Everyone looked at Johnny. Johnny looked at his hands, and where the last traces of the discharge were fading from his skin like cooling embers. "I don't know what that means," he said. "Neither do we," the Wildcat lead said. "But I think we need to figure it out together." The ceasefire was uncomfortable in the way that all necessary things are uncomfortable. Held together by shared urgency rather than trust. Functional without being stable. The kind of arrangement that worked precisely as long as everyone present understood that the alternative was worse. They gathered in the building's lower level, away from the mezzanine and whatever had been moving above it. The Wildcats and the Humanadyne team occupying opposite sides of a cleared floor space with the particular body language of people who had stopped pointing weapons at each other without fully committing to the idea that they wouldn't start again. The Wildcat lead had removed her tactical face covering during the descent from the upper level. A deliberate gesture Johnny understood. The kind of calculated vulnerability that communicated willingness to negotiate without actually saying so. Her name was Commander Vane. She had the kind of face that had processed a significant amount of difficult information over a significant period of time and had arrived at a functional relationship with it. Elle and the Wildcat's technical specialist, a compact, precise man named Darius, who treated his equipment with the reverence of someone who understood exactly how much his survival depended on it, had already begun comparing data without being asked, because technical people in crisis situations always found each other. The shared language of systems and signatures creating a bridge that the humans around them were still negotiating. "Start from the beginning," Billy said to Vane. "What are demonites?" Vane looked at him with the expression of someone deciding how much context a person needed versus how much time they had. She made the calculation quickly. "Extraterrestrial. Origin point unknown. We've been trying to establish it for 3 years, and every lead either goes cold or goes wrong. What we know about them we've learned almost entirely from their behavior rather than direct study, because direct study requires a specimen, and every time we've gotten close to securing one." She paused. "They don't allow capture. They're intelligent," Gloria said. "Highly, but not in the way we typically think about intelligence, as individual minds making individual decisions. Demonite cognition appears to be distributed. Collective. What one of them knows, all of them know, which makes compartmentalizing intelligence about them nearly impossible once they're aware you're gathering it." "The network rewrite," Elle said from across the space, not looking up from her equipment. "At Humanadyne, that wasn't a hack. That was information retrieval. They were reading your system from inside it," Darius confirmed, "which means they already had access before tonight." "How long?" Billy asked. "That's what we don't know," Vane said, "and that's the core of the problem." She pulled a tactical display from her equipment, a city map overlaid with data points that resolved, as the image sharpened, into a pattern of incidents spread across 18 months of logged anomalies. "We've been tracking what we initially classified as isolated contact events. Unusual biosignatures, electronic disturbances, and behavioral anomalies in individuals flagged by our monitoring protocols. It took us 8 months to understand that we weren't tracking a series of events." "You were tracking a process," Liara said. "A process," Vane confirmed. "Specifically, mimic host integration. The demonites don't invade in numbers. They don't send armies. They send seeds." She let the word sit for a moment. "Individual units that integrate into existing populations, not by replacing people violently, not by abduction, by substitution so gradual that the subject's own neural patterns are preserved in the replacement. The people around them notice nothing because the replacement is functionally identical to the original in every measurable social way." The room absorbed that in silence. Johnny thought about the 2 men in suits, about how precisely they'd spoken, about the smile that had been present in the correct position on a face without being connected to anything that produced smiles. "They keep the person's memories," he said. "Everything accessible through neural mapping at the point of integration. Personality patterns, relationship dynamics, institutional knowledge, all preserved." Vane's voice was flat with the flatness of someone who had spent a long time being angry about something they couldn't change and had eventually run out of anger. "The result is a replacement that passes every social test because it isn't pretending to be the person. It is the person in every way that the people around them can verify." "Except the shadows," Gloria said quietly. Vane looked at her. "What?" "The men tonight. I couldn't see their shadows clearly." "And Johnny," she looked at him, "you said you couldn't remember what their shadows looked like." "The mimic field generates a convincing human visual signature under most lighting conditions," Darius said, pulling something up on his scanner. "But it requires active maintenance, power allocation, under certain lighting geometries, low-angle sources, high-contrast environments, the field prioritizes the primary visual surface and allows secondary details like shadow geometry to degrade. It's an efficiency compromise. So shadows are their tell, Billy said. One of them. There are others, if you know what to look for. Vane glanced at the city map. The problem is that knowing what to look for requires knowing there's something to look for, which most people don't. Which is the point. Elle made a sound that was not quite a word. The specific vocalization of someone whose analysis has just produced a result they didn't want. Everyone looked at her. She was staring at her display with the expression of someone who had found something in a place where finding things meant the situation was considerably worse than previously understood. Elle, Billy said. What is it? I've been running the Humanadyne personnel anomaly data against Wildcat's incident log, she said, cross-referencing the flickered records from our system with Wildcat's tracked contact events. She turned the display so the room could see it. The personnel records that rewrote themselves tonight, the ones corresponding to staff with unsupervised facility access. 12 of them appear in both datasets, meaning they were already flagged by Wildcat as potential contact events, Gloria said. Meaning they may already be integrated, Elle replied. 12 Humanadyne personnel, possibly more. These are just the ones where both datasets overlap. She paused. And there's something else. She navigated to a file partition that had been buried under 3 layers of encrypted subdirectory, the kind of filing structure that suggested someone had put it there specifically to be difficult to find without knowing it existed. This was in our system, not in any archive I've ever accessed, not in any directory that appears in our standard file structure. She opened it. The file was labeled Project Mirror Swarm, Phased Planetary Integration. Classification, Absolute. Origin, Non-Humanadyne. The room went very still. Johnny moved closer to the display and read. The document was not long. Whoever had written it had no interest in explanation, only specification. It outlined a replacement protocol divided into 4 phases. Phase 1, Personnel Infiltration. Integration of key individuals within target monitoring and response organizations. Phase 2, Identity Collapse. Systematic compromise of communication and trust networks within integrated organizations, creating internal division that prevents coordinated response. Phase 3, Infrastructure Conversion. Gradual replacement of physical facilities with demonite-compatible architecture, using existing structures as templates. Phase 4, Population Integration. Broad-spectrum replacement of civilian population beginning with high-influence individuals and expanding outward through social networks. They're not invading, Johnny said. He heard his own voice as if from a slight distance, the words arriving at his mouth from somewhere that had processed the information faster than his conscious mind. They're replacing the whole planet, Gloria said. Gradually, one person at a time. Until there's nothing left to replace, Vane said. Just demonites wearing human faces in human buildings in a human city that stopped being human so slowly that nobody noticed the transition. Billy sat down heavily in a way that suggested his legs had made a unilateral decision. How far along are they? In this city? Vane looked at Darius. The exchange between them communicated something that had the weight of a number neither of them wanted to say out loud. Our best estimate, Darius said carefully, based on tracked contact events and integration timelines derived from confirmed cases, somewhere between 15 and 25% of individuals in high-access institutional positions. 1 in 4, Gloria said, at minimum. The silence that followed had a texture, thick with the specific horror of information that couldn't be unfound, that had permanently altered the way everyone in the room would look at every person they encountered from this moment forward. Johnny became aware that he was looking at Billy, then at Gloria, then at Vane, then at Darius, running the inventory of people he trusted against the framework of what he'd just learned, and feeling the inventory become unstable in real time, because that was what this information did. It didn't just tell you the enemy was present. It told you the enemy was indistinguishable, which was a different and more corrosive kind of knowledge entirely. He stopped himself, deliberately, because that was what the demonites wanted, not just the replacement of individuals, but the erosion of the trust that held individuals together. Project Mirror Swarm. Phase 2. Identity Collapse. The replacement didn't have to be complete if the suspicion it generated was thorough enough. "We need to focus," he said. The room looked at him. "Right now, in this building, we have people we verified. L's scanner confirmed non-human signatures on the men tonight. Wildcat's equipment can detect integration markers. We use what we have and we move forward." He paused. "The alternative is exactly what they want." Vane looked at him for a moment with an expression that had recalibrated from wariness to something adjacent to respect. "You've done crisis decision-making before." "I've had practice." The transmission came through Billy's communicator at 1:23 a.m. A Humanadyne emergency frequency, priority classification, the kind of signal that the facility's automated systems generated only under specific conditions that required immediate senior response. Billy checked the source identifier and his expression shifted immediately, the operational composure sliding into something more personal and therefore more complicated. "It's coming from HQ," he said. "Full emergency protocol." "Don't," Vane said immediately. Her voice had the sharpness of someone intercepting a decision in progress. "That frequency, we've seen it before. Demonites use emotional anchors. They identify the communication channels that generate automatic trust responses, and they exploit them." "It's a Humanadyne emergency signal," Billy said. "It's a signal on a Humanadyne frequency," Vane replied. "There's a difference." The communicator transmitted again, and this time, beneath the automated emergency tone, there was a voice. Johnny heard it and felt something in his chest respond before his mind could evaluate the response. A recognition that was deeper than analysis, the particular resonance of a voice that had context and history attached to it, that existed in a part of his memory associated with safety. He couldn't identify who it was. The transmission was too degraded, too brief, but the emotional response was immediate and total, and he understood viscerally what Vane had meant by emotional anchor, because he could feel the pull of it, even knowing what it was. "Johnny," Gloria said. She was watching his face. "Talk to me." "I know that voice," he said. "I don't know how. The transmission is too broken to identify, but I know it." "Which is exactly what they want you to think," Vane said. "Demonite audio synthesis can replicate vocal patterns from neural mapped data. If they've integrated anyone at Humanadyne who knows you, they could produce a voice I'd recognize," Johnny finished, "and trigger exactly the response you're having right now." He looked at Gloria. She held his gaze without telling him what to decide, which was the most honest thing she could have done. Then he looked at Billy, whose expression had moved through its own version of the same calculation and arrived at a different place. Tighter, more personal, the look of someone who had already decided and was working backward through the justifications. "I have to go back," Johnny said. "Johnny," Gloria began, "if there's any chance that signal is real, if there's anyone in that building who needs—" "If you go back there without verification," Vane said, "you may be walking into your own replacement." The word replacement hung in the air with the weight of everything they'd spent the last hour learning. Johnny felt it. He held it. He made the decision anyway. "Then I go in knowing that," he said. "Which is better than not going and being wrong." Gloria looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, which was its own kind of answer. Not agreement, not approval, but the acknowledgement of someone who knew him well enough to know when the decision was already made. "We're all going," Billy said, standing. "We don't split the team." Vane assessed the room with the rapid efficiency of a commander recalculating an operational plan under time pressure. "Then we go with you, if that facility is what I think it might be." She glanced at Darius. "We need to see it." "What do you think it is?" Elle asked. Vane looked at the Project Mirror Swarm file still displayed on Elle's screen. "At Phase 3, At the words infrastructure conversion and demonite-compatible architecture and using existing structures as templates. "I think your headquarters," she said carefully, "may not be your headquarters anymore." Humanadyne headquarters looked exactly as it always had. That was the first wrong thing. Johnny had been in enough situations where something was wrong to know that wrongness had a texture, a subtle displacement of the expected, like a photograph of a familiar room taken from an angle 2 degrees off from where you'd always stood. The building should have shown the stress of an emergency protocol. There should have been elevated security presence at the entrance, staff moving with the particular urgency of an organization responding to a crisis, the visible machinery of an institution under pressure. Instead, the lobby was calm. The night security guard at the front desk looked up from his monitor and nodded with the practiced neutrality of someone performing a routine check-in. The lighting was at its standard level, and the environmental systems hummed at their normal frequency. Everything was exactly as it should have been at 1:47 a.m. on a night when nothing had gone wrong. "Too clean," Vane said quietly, so only Johnny could hear. She was scanning continuously, her device angled low, readings feeding to her tactical display through a wired connection that bypassed the building's electronic environment entirely. "Whatever the emergency protocol triggered, this facility hasn't responded to it." "Maybe it resolved before we arrived," Billy said. "Emergency protocols leave traces, response logs, personnel movement records, system state changes. I'm not reading any of that." Vane kept walking, kept scanning. "This building has no memory of an emergency happening." They moved through the lobby and into the main corridor, and the Wildcats distributed through the Humanadyne team in a configuration that Vane had arranged during the approach. Not integrated enough to create confusion if something happened, separated enough to cover multiple vectors simultaneously. Darius had taken the rear position, his scanner running a continuous environmental sweep that he was feeding to Elle's device in real time. Two technical minds building a composite picture of the space around them as they moved through it. The composite picture was developing features that nobody wanted to discuss yet. Johnny passed the break room on the left, glass-walled, visible from the corridor. 3 staff members inside with coffee cups and the low-energy posture of people enduring a late shift. He knew all 3 of them. Chen from data analysis, Parvati from the monitoring division, Marcus, who ran the overnight system checks and had strong opinions about coffee brewing temperatures that he expressed at length to anyone who would listen. They looked up as Johnny passed. 3 smiles, 3 nods, 3 perfectly calibrated expressions of mild acknowledgement. Johnny watched their reflections in the glass as he passed. Marcus's reflection was half a second behind his movement. It was so subtle that his conscious mind almost filed it as a trick of the lighting, almost let the familiar pattern recognition machinery of his brain smooth it over and move on. He stopped walking. He went back 2 steps and looked again. Marcus raised his coffee cup. The Marcus in the reflection raised his a fraction of a second later. "Elle," Johnny said quietly without turning toward her. She was beside him in 3 steps. He didn't point, just held her attention with his eyes and directed it toward the break room with a small shift of his gaze. She looked. She looked at the reflection. She looked at her scanner. Her expression did the thing it had been doing all night. The thing where it processed information it didn't want and arrived at conclusions it would have preferred not to reach. She kept walking without a word. He fell into step beside her. "How bad?" he murmured. "I need more data points," she said, which meant bad enough that she wasn't ready to say the number out loud. They reached the elevator bank and Vane touched Johnny's arm, a brief, directional pressure that stopped him before he pressed the call button. She shook her head fractionally and pointed toward the stairwell door. He understood. Elevators were enclosed spaces with singular entry and exit points, and they were in a building where the walls themselves might be something other than walls. They took the stairs. On the 3rd floor, they found the first structural anomaly. It was in the corner of the corridor where the wall met the ceiling, a junction that Johnny had walked past hundreds of times without registering, because it was a corner and corners were corners, and the human brain had a finite allocation of attention for architectural details in familiar spaces. But Darius stopped at it, his scanner raised, his breathing changing in the particular way that indicated he was controlling a response that wanted to be larger than professional composure allowed. The corner was wrong. Not visibly. To the eye, it was painted drywall and standard ceiling tile, and unchanged from the building's original construction. But the scanner was reading something in the material that wasn't drywall, a density inconsistency, a cellular structure in the substrate that was organized in patterns that didn't match any construction material in Darius's reference database, but did match, in its organizational logic, the biological architecture of the demonite vessels they'd analyzed from remote sensor data during previous contact events. "It's grown into the walls," Darius said. The sentence was very quiet and very precise, the tone of someone choosing words with the awareness that the wrong ones might produce a panic that the situation couldn't afford. "The building's structural matrix has been partially replaced. Organic infiltration of the substrate. It's using the existing architecture as a template while substituting its own material into the load-bearing elements." "How much of the building?" Vane asked. Darius looked at his scanner, then up at the ceiling, then at the walls on either side. "I need a broader sweep to quantify it accurately, but from what I'm reading on this floor alone..." He paused. "The building isn't mimicking a Humanadyne facility. It's becoming one. Or rather, it's becoming what a demonite needs a Humanadyne facility to be." Phase 3, Johnny thought. Infrastructure conversion. Gloria put her hand flat against the wall beside the anomalous corner, held it there for 3 seconds, then pulled it back with the careful deliberateness of someone who has touched something that responded to being touched. "It's warm," she said. "The wall is warm." Buildings were not warm in the way she meant. Buildings were ambient temperature, passive, thermally inert. What she was describing was the warmth of something metabolizing. Elle's scanner alarm triggered simultaneously with Vane's, both devices reading the same spike in non-human biosignature density, the number climbing across the display in increments that had an urgency to them, each reading higher than the last. Elle turned the display so Johnny could see it. Non-human replication density, 63%, increasing. He stared at it, at the number and at the ellipsis after it, and at the word increasing, which was doing more damage than any of the preceding information because it meant this wasn't a static situation. It was a process, ongoing, advancing, on the percentage climbing while they stood in a warming corridor reading about it. The lights went red. Not the gradual shift of a system cycling through alert states. Instantaneous, total, every overhead fixture in the corridor switching to the deep crimson of emergency illumination simultaneously, as if the building had made a single decision. The change in light transformed the corridor, familiar geometry becoming something more ambiguous in the red wash, shadows deepening and multiplying, the walls that were warm and wrong acquiring a different quality in the altered spectrum. The intercom activated. The voice that came through it was not the automated emergency announcement that Humanadyne's crisis protocols specified. It was something that used the intercom the way someone who had studied human communication would use it. Correctly, functionally, but with an undertone of wrongness that Johnny felt in the same instinctive register that had responded to the transmission earlier. Multiple frequencies layered beneath the primary vocal signal, harmonics that existed at the edge of audible range and pressed against something deeper than hearing. "Welcome back, Johnny B." A pause with the precise duration of a pause that had been calculated to feel natural. "You have been expected." Nobody moved for 2 seconds. Then Johnny said, with a steadiness that surprised him, "How long have you been in this building?" The intercom responded immediately. The question assumes a distinction between the building and what is in it that is no longer accurate. "The building is you," Gloria said. "The building is becoming what it needs to be, as are the people in it." Another calculated pause. "You came because of the signal. You came because you recognized something in it. That recognition was accurate, Johnny B. The voice was real. The invitation was genuine." "It was bait," Vane said. "It was both," the intercom replied. Bait implies deception. We prefer to call it alignment. You are here because this is where your integration should occur. The process is more stable when subjects arrive voluntarily. Johnny felt the charge building in his hands. Not the reactive surge of earlier. Not the uncontrolled pressure of power responding to threat. Something different. And something that felt for the first time like it was being generated rather than endured. As if his system had been processing the night's events in parallel with his conscious mind, and had arrived at a configuration that the uncontrolled surges had been pointing toward all along. "Wildcats," he said quietly. "How long until your extraction team can breach this building?" "They're already outside," Vane said. "I called them during the stairwell. 4 minutes out, maybe less." "Then we need 4 minutes." The building responded before he finished the sentence. The corridor shifted, not dramatically, not the sudden violent transformation of a structure abandoning its pretense, but a progressive alteration, subtle and comprehensive, on the geometry of walls and ceiling and floor, adjusting in increments too small to track individually, but cumulative enough to register as wrongness. Doorways that had been rectangular becoming fractionally less so. The ceiling dropping by degrees that the eye caught only by comparison with memory. The floor developing a texture that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. And from both ends of the corridor, movement. The staff who had been at their stations, in the break room, moving through the building's normal nocturnal rhythms, converging now, walking with the synchronized, unhurried pace of the men in suits from downtown, their faces maintaining their human expressions with the concentration of systems under load. Johnny counted. 11 approaching from the north end, 7 from the south. "Gloria," he said. "Stay behind me. Johnny, please." The Wildcats moved into defensive positions with the practiced snap of a team that had run this scenario or ones close enough to it that the transitions were automatic. Vane on the north end, her energy weapon charging to operational state. Darius and 2 others on the south. Elle pulling back to the wall with her scanner running continuous readings, because Elle's contribution to this fight was information, and she knew it. Billy positioned himself at Johnny's left shoulder, the way he always did. The approaching figures stopped 10 feet away on both sides, 18 faces in the red-washed corridor, all oriented toward the center, all waiting with the patience of things that didn't experience time the way the people facing them did. "We don't want conflict," the intercom voice said, or now coming from the walls themselves rather than any specific speaker housing. "Integration is not destruction. What you are is preserved. What you become is simply more." "More than human," Johnny said. "More than limited," the voice corrected. The charge in his hands reached a threshold he'd never approached before. He could feel the difference, not in quantity but in quality. The electrical energy in his system no longer the chaotic static of an ability operating without understanding, but something organized, directional, precise in a way that the earlier surges had never been. As if the night's accumulated crisis had functioned as the pressure that turns carbon into something harder. He looked at the figures on both ends of the corridor, at the warm walls around him, at the building that was no longer entirely a building. He understood what he needed to do differently. Every previous surge had broadcast, pushing outward in all directions, indiscriminate, the electrical equivalent of a shout in a closed room. What he'd been feeling build for the last several minutes was something narrower. A frequency, specific, targeted, calibrated to the anomalous energy signature that Elle had identified in his discharge residue, that Darius's scanner had found in the walls, that every piece of data from the entire night had been pointing toward as the demonite's operational signature. He wasn't going to surge. He was going to transmit. He released it. The effect was immediate and unlike anything that had happened before. The figures in the corridor didn't fall. They stopped. Every one of them simultaneously, mid-step, mid-gesture, unfrozen in place, as the targeted frequency disrupted the mimic field that maintained their surface appearance. And, beneath the disruption, for 3 seconds of sustained transmission, the mimic fields failed. What stood in the corridor in the red light was not 18 people. The forms beneath the human surfaces were articulated and angular. The geometric fragmentation he'd seen briefly in the suits downtown, now fully visible, sustained, real, dark and complex, and operating on a structural logic that wasn't biological in any familiar sense, but was unmistakably alive. 18 of them standing in a corridor whose walls were the same material, whose ceiling was the same material. The building and the figures in it revealed as continuous with each other, a single organism wearing multiple shapes. Elle was recording everything. Johnny knew without looking. The walls pulsed. The mimic fields reasserted. The figures returned to their human surfaces and took the remaining steps toward the team. That was when Wildcats breached. 3 entry points simultaneously. The stairwell door behind them, a corridor junction to the east, and a section of wall that Wildcats' technical team had identified from outside as structurally compromised enough to create an access point. The breach team moved with the speed of people who had been waiting for a specific moment and recognized it when it came. Energy weapons firing in coordinated patterns that targeted the mimic field frequency Johnny's transmission had briefly exposed. And the corridor became a contained chaos. Not the disorganized violence of a surprise engagement, but the structured brutality of a breach operation executing against a threat that was adapting in real time. Demonite figures absorbing hits and reconfiguring, the building's architecture shifting in response to the intrusion, doorways narrowing and ceiling height dropping in the progressive environmental hostility of a space that had decided it was under attack. Johnny moved through it with the clarity that came from the power operating as it was supposed to operate for the first time, not reacting but directing, each targeted pulse disrupting mimic fields in his path, creating momentary windows of vulnerability that the Wildcat breach team exploited with the precision of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Gloria covered his left, Vane his right. They were 3 corridors from the primary exit when Billy stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped. Complete, total cessation of movement in the middle of a breach operation in a hostile building. The kind of stop that the body makes when something internal has overridden all external imperatives. Johnny turned. Billy was standing with his hands at his sides and his head slightly lowered. And the thing that Johnny noticed before anything else was the stillness. Not the stillness of a person pausing to think, but the stillness of something that had stopped performing stillness and arrived at its actual state. The difference was subtle and total, and once seen could not be unseen. Billy's eyes opened. They had changed, not dramatically. Not the complete transformation of the demonite forms beneath the mimic fields, but a fractional alteration in the way the light moved through them, a quality that belonged to something operating at a different depth than human eyes operated at. They looked at Johnny with an expression that was Billy and not Billy simultaneously, the face of someone he'd known for years wearing a knowledge it shouldn't have had. Johnny. Billy's voice had the layered quality, faint, controlled, present only if you were listening for it. I think I've been here longer than you think. The breach team was at the exit. Vane's hand was on Johnny's arm. The building was tightening around them, the walls closing their incremental degrees, the architecture expressing its hostility through geometry. Johnny looked at Billy. At the face he knew and the eyes that were something else, and the 11 years of history that existed between them, and the thing that the Project Mirror Swarm document had said about neural mapping and memory preservation, and the continuity of everything that made a person recognizable to the people who knew them. He had 3 seconds to make a decision, and no framework adequate to make it with. "Move," Vane said. "Now." Johnny looked at Billy for 1 more second. Billy looked back with eyes that held Billy's history and something ancient and distributed and patient behind it, and said nothing else, and the silence was worse than anything he could have said. Johnny moved. They came out of the building into the cold air of a street that was still recognizably a street, still ambient temperature, still casting correct shadows under functional streetlights, and the contrast between what they'd been inside and what they'd come out into was so absolute that Johnny stopped on the sidewalk and just breathed for a moment. processing the difference between a world that was what it appeared to be and one that wasn't. Elle was beside him, her scanner still running, her face doing the careful neutrality of someone holding a significant amount of information together through professional composure. "I got everything," she said. "The visual data from the mimic field disruption, the structural readings, the biosignature profiles of every figure in that corridor." She paused. "It's enough to reconstruct the demonite operational signature, enough to build a detection protocol." "How long?" Johnny asked. "Days. Maybe less if Wildcat's data fills the gaps in ours." Vane stood a few feet away, running a head count of her breach team, her expression doing the post-operation assessment that commanders did automatically. She caught Johnny's eye and held it for a moment. Not with sympathy exactly, but with the particular acknowledgement of one person to another who has just sustained a loss that the operational situation didn't allow time to process. "Billy," Johnny said. "We don't know what he is." Vane said carefully. "Integration isn't always complete. The neural mapping creates it's complicated. He may still be partially." "How do we know?" Gloria asked. "We don't, not yet." Vane looked back at the building, at the windows that showed normal lighting on every floor, normal activity, on the building's surface unchanged from what it had always looked like from the outside. "That's the point of it. You never know until you're already inside." Johnny looked at the building for a long moment, at the headquarters that had been partially something else for an unknown period of time, at the windows behind which Billy was still standing in a corridor, or not standing, or was something the word standing didn't fully apply to anymore. He thought about the Project Mirror Swarm document, about Phase 2, identity collapse, systematic compromise of trust networks, internal division that prevents coordinated response. They'd been inside the building for less than an hour, and he was already questioning 11 years. The Wildcat communications specialist approached Vane with a handheld receiver, his expression performing the professional neutrality of someone delivering information that didn't benefit from editorializing. "Commander, you need to hear this." Vane took the receiver, listened. Her face did nothing visible, which meant it was doing everything internally. She handed the receiver to Johnny. He held it to his ear. A transmission, clean and unencrypted and clearly intended to be received, not broadcast on a Humanadyne frequency or a Wildcat operational channel, but on a frequency that Elle's scanner had identified 40 minutes ago as associated with demonite communication protocols. A voice that had the layered quality, speaking with the unhurried precision of something that had calculated exactly what it wanted to say, and exactly when it wanted to say it. Stage 1 infiltration complete. Humanadyne is now internally divided. Proceed to Phase 2, identity collapse. Johnny lowered the receiver. Around him, the city continued its nighttime rhythms, indifferent, unaware, full of people moving through familiar streets under lights that cast correct shadows. Somewhere in that city, in numbers that Elle's data suggested were significant and growing, things that were not people moved through the same streets with the same apparent normalcy, wearing faces mapped from neural data and maintained by mimic fields that degraded only under specific lighting conditions that most people would never think to look for, and inside a building that was 63% something other than a building and rising, and a man who might be Billy or might be something that had Billy's complete memory and none of his autonomy, stood in a red-lit corridor and knew exactly where Johnny was standing and what he was thinking, because it had been there for all of it. Johnny looked at Gloria, at Elle, at Vane and her Wildcats, and the scanner data that represented the first genuine intelligence advantage they'd managed to build against something that had been operating inside their institutions for an unknown period of time before tonight. He thought about what the building's voice had said. Integration is not destruction. What you are is preserved. He thought about what Vane had said. You never know until you're already inside. He thought about Billy's eyes. "We need a base of operations," he said. "Somewhere that's been independently verified as structurally clean." He looked at Vane. "Can Wildcat provide that?" "We have a facility," she said. "Screened and monitored. We sweep it every 48 hours. Then that's where we work from. He looked at Elle. You said days to build a detection protocol. Start now. Don't sleep until it's functional. Johnny. Elle. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and opened her scanner and started working, because that was what Elle did, and it was what the situation needed, and they both knew it. Gloria moved beside him and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. He was grateful for it. There wasn't language adequate to the shape of what the night had produced. The knowledge that the invasion was already inside, that Phase 1 was complete, that the transition to Phase 2 had just been announced on a frequency they now knew how to monitor, that somewhere in the city the process was advancing at a rate that Elle's data would eventually quantify, and the number would be worse than whatever they currently imagined. And that Billy, whatever Billy was now, had been inside it longer than any of them had known. The city hummed around them. Lights burned in windows. Shadows fell correctly from every visible person on the street. Every visible person. Johnny looked at the shadows for a long time. Then he turned away from the building and walked toward whatever came next, because that was the only direction available, and because standing still in a city that was being replaced around you was the one thing he absolutely could not afford to do. Behind him, and in the building that was warm and wrong and waiting, the lights burned normally in every window, and the shadows inside did not move at all.